Montano Part 2. Mid-2280. Over a year and a half had passed since Montano's arrival on the Mojave front, and, although the work of his century's terror, force was slow at the start, it picked up over time. After the fall of Cottonwood Cove and the arrival of Legion forces in Nevada Territory proper, it was decided by this independent force to take things slow. After all, the Legion's presence on that side of the river was its own message of terror. The forces under Montano and the other units assigned to terrorize the people in this land almost didn't have to do anything, so long as the fortifications around Cottonwood Cove grew taller and stronger. The message of what was coming seeped more and more into the minds of people across the desert, with each time word of their presence was passed between traders along the old roads or troopers returned to California on leave. Many didn't know why the Legion seemed to only anchor itself in that small little town for so long, and the sedentary state of the Legion gave rise to some doubt about their presence at all. Many traders and locals began to ignore the warnings, with some even setting out to see if the stories about Legion forces in the West were true. Many people of the Mojave walked the highways east of Searchlight to find themselves looking down the winding roads and cliffs leading to Cottonwood Cove and ending up speechless at the truth of those stories. The small town sat beside the river, and those who stood upon those cliffs looking east would see the place sprawling with soldiers in red marching and patrolling to and fro, with a seemingly endless stream of boats and rafts packed to the brim with more barbaric servants of Caesar pouring into the Mojave. Many of those curious locals and traders never came back from those cliffs, finding themselves wondering what happened when they awake in a slave-packed cage surrounded by vicious dogs and blood-red banners in every direction. Although it appeared like the Legion was staying in place, the locals and traders who managed to walk away from those cliffs couldn't understand what the Legion was doing there until gunshots rained from the cliffs along the 164 to Nipton. All across the south from Calnevari to Novak to as far west as Prim, the Legion forces owned the roads of southern Nevada in everything but name. Legion raiders would hit everything from caravans to entire companies of NCR troops heading to installations across the Mojave. Every raid would leave many bodies to decay in the sun, and many were dragged back to Cottonwood Cove in chains while few were spared only to spread the word. Each time, the Legion raiders would disappear into the desert before a response force from Camp Searchlight or a nearby ranger station could arrive. But when the NCR forces inevitably arrived, they would only find the bodies, the burning wreckage, and a flag of the bull showing who was responsible for the scene. All the while, the message spread that nobody traveling in the southern Mojave was safe. The NCR couldn't keep them safe, and the crosses surrounding that slave post at Cottonwood Cove would creep further and further west. This is not to say that the Legion forces in the Mojave had it easy. There was in fact a reason that the boats continued to cross from Arizona into the west, and that was because the attrition rate was especially high. Even when the raids were successful, the guarded caravans of the west very often did a number on the Legion raiders, with each guard usually packing the kind of firepower that wasn't as common in the east. Despite the firepower of profligate traders, soldiers, and travelers, the Legion was no stranger to taking losses and going back for seconds, and with the campaigns in the east continuing so successfully. Manpower was mostly a secondary issue on this front, although the experience of those legionaries was. Understanding this, Montano and other commanders of the southern Mojave knew that most of the Legion's more experienced soldiers were still campaigning in the east. And although centurions like Montano were no strangers to the type of guerrilla warfare seen in Colorado, many of the recruits and primes under his command were. To remedy this, Montano and his fellow commanders in the Terror decided it was best to split their forces in order to better deal with the kinds of threats the southern front was encountering. With the veterans and scouts predominantly busy waging their ongoing war against NCR's rangers across the south, centurions of the Terror sought to fix the experience problem by releasing their recruits into the thick of it. This meant recruits were dispatched as the bulk of the raiding force along the highways under strict but simple orders. The recruits were to assault caravans or NCR patrols as deemed acceptable by the recruit-level decani, take what was valuable and enslave who they could, or die trying. This suicidal strategy regarding the recruits achieved two victories in the minds of commanders like Montano. The first is that the surviving officers or legionaries would become battle-hardened upon their successful return to Cottonwood Cove. The other success came even with the complete annihilation of these recruit raiders. Such events were their own form of message to the West. There had been many occasions in the Terror campaign where whole groups of recruit ambushers failed in their objective of gathering slaves and plunder. However, the victory in that came from the message received by the profligate survivors. Those traders from the West who survived a brutal raid of 20 recruits swarming from the sands were always traumatized by the fact that none of their attackers surrendered. As the survivors saw to their dead or injured, they'd know for the rest of their lives that the Legion would come for them to the very last man. As high as the attrition rate was for the terror forces, the objective was solidified more and more into the minds of the Mojave's locals and people all across California. Over time, the same message continued to be sent until word reached the terror's commanders about the new supply situation with their brothers at the fort. By the start of 2280, the sight of independent traders from the east heading up to Fortification Hill was a regular sight, and one that sparked an idea in the minds of Montano and the other commanders across the southern front. With approval from Lord Caesar, forces of the Terror began allowing and dispatching certain approved traders from New Mexico and Arizona into the West. Many traders jumped at the idea, excited to peddle their wares in the storied civilized lands of the West. Although the idea of issuing more lethal secondary objectives to the traders had crossed the commanders' minds, they decided to hold off on that, as there was a more impactful opportunity hidden in the Legion's generous permission. Traders from the east began to trickle across the river, marching without escort into the West. Needless to say, this was the first time Rangers and NCR scouts had ever witnessed traders leaving Cottonwood Cove, and the first ones were followed, of course. Many traders were watched almost in awe as they strolled out of Cottonwood Cove, loaded with wares, and into the streets of the NCR's nearby Camp Searchlight, as if it were nothing. For obvious reasons, these caravans were halted and searched by NCR soldiers, checked for bombs, and those innocent traders were immediately jailed as possible spies until more could be learned. Under NCR arrest, each story from every Eastern trader was nearly identical to the last. The trader lived in the Arizona or New Mexican town of what have you, and was left alone by the Legion so long as they didn't try to sell them drugs or weapons. Why these first merchants were allowed west was unknown to both the traders themselves and NCR interrogators, but each caravan was completely bomb-free. And the strip searches at each checkpoint didn't even reveal a hidden chem stash like almost all Western caravans had. Being well familiar with the NCR nation through interrogation of captured troopers, the Legion commanders of the Terror knew that NCR laws would force the soldiers to release those Eastern traders provided that malicious intent couldn't be proven. While the Eastern traders were in holding, soldiers at places like Searchlight were only able to agree with their orders to release them after hearing from the occasional trader who detailed their hidden motive: to seize the westbound opportunity. As it was mentioned, many of the towns across New Mexico and several in Arizona fell to the Legion in the campaigns immediately post-Hoover Dam. Many of those traders were out when the Legion seized their hometowns and were forced to continue their job of supplying the Legion as needed without any complaint. A trader who had his hometown burned simply wasn't allowed to be upset about the fact in presence of their Legion customers. And many of them told NCR forces story after story about how honest a customer the Legion usually was, so long as you didn't defy them in any observable way. In the end, many of those wrong traders jumped at the opportunity to leave the East with their betrayer's blessing, and did so. While in NCR captivity, NCR soldiers didn't quite know what to make of the traders who apparently couldn't cross the river fast enough. Although the question was raised once more about why exactly the Legion permitted this in the first place, the answer would come not long after NCR's decision to release these honest merchants of the East. So, without the legal ability to detain wastelanders from outside NCR borders without just cause, the traders couldn't be hindered from doing business regardless of the red bulls painted on their carts or their contract bearing Caesar's sigil. At first, these traders were allowed further west under escort by NCR soldiers, and this was when the message commanders like Montano had in mind could be announced to the Mojave. The merchants of the East would march their wares along the old roads freshly released from NCR arrest and excited to visit lands they'd only heard tales about. Accompanied by soldiers of the West who were far more agreeable than their Eastern counterparts, these traders looked forward to visiting new lands only for their thoughts to be cut short when shots rang out on both sides of the road. The trader is stunned. He'd never been ambushed by highwaymen out east. The crosses and displays of mutilation along Legion roads said pretty clearly what happened to anyone who interfered with Legion-marked caravans. The merchant finally understands what the NCR soldiers were for, if not for supervision. But why weren't they helping? The trader watches each soldier get perforated by bullets. Before a shot is fired, he hears the boom of the explosions, and a cloud of dust blankets the area. He sees a figure fly out of the dust and bring the last soldier to the hot asphalt beyond his vision. Too blinded by the dust and chaos, all he hears is that trooper's blood-curdling scream before the incoherent gurgling and choking sound of a man getting his neck opened. Then, there's silence. The dust begins to slowly clear away, and the trader turns around to see 4 figures standing in the cloud. It's his caravan hands. When the trader realizes that he and his whole crew are fine, the dust has cleared just enough to show he's surrounded. It clears a little more, and he finds himself surrounded by the soldiers of Kaisar. I didn't think I'd see any of them west of that searchlight place. The trader thinks to himself before the one with the big feather helmet approaches him. He's been around the Legion enough to know this one is called a decani or something like that, and he's pretty sure this one is a prime, while the others appear to be of the same or lower veterancy. Before the trader can say anything or survey the damage he was spared, the officer thunders. "Trader, present your contract." The merchant glances at all 3 of his living Brahmin and the bull emblem painted on each cargo box as he sees the dead California soldiers and reflexively reaches for his bag. Withdrawing the contract for the commander as he'd done 1,000 other times at each Legion outpost in the East, he awaits the inevitable inspection of his wares for contraband. However, the trader is surprised when the officer instead looks up from the papers and thunders. "Carry on. Ensure you take the dirt path on the left once you reach the ancient refueling station up the highway. Stay on that path and avoid the highway from there to Nipton, for we believe the remainder of that stretch is plagued by bandits who've yet to be taught Lord Kaisar's lesson." True to Kaisar, the Decanus stares at the trader through his completely covered face and abruptly raises a hand pointed west, a sign that he is to immediately depart their presence. With a departing and nervous, "Thank you, sir. Hail Kaisar!" The trader and his crew immediately set out, occasionally glancing back at the legionaries looting the killed NCR troopers. He turns around for the last time when he sees a pair of the legionaries drag one of the California soldiers to his feet. Eyes facing west, he and his crew hear the distant commander bark. "Do you understand why those merchants were spared, profligate?" The trader didn't hear the rest, but that was all right because he knew why he was spared, why his caravan was spared. The Decanus explained to the surviving soldier that although the trader may not have ever physically bowed to Kaisar, he did when he was given the Legion trade contract. He did when the Red Bulls were painted on each of his caravan storage crates. The soldier saw his friends die on a stretch of road he thought was under NCR control. He watched them die and got to watch the people he thought he was protecting walk away. The soldier learned just how futile his whole service had been, how incompetent he really was, and how the Legion could promise things that he and his killed friends couldn't. The soldier was released, allowed to return to Camp Searchlight and relay the message of what happened, while the Legion raiders disappeared into the desert and the trader continued west to fulfill the message that Montano and the other commanders of Legion Terror intended. That trader, and countless others like him, would experience similar situations on their journeys through the southern Mojave. Those traders would eventually see the lands of NCR, stop in every city and NCR checkpoint from Shady Sands to Dayglow to Redding. Every time they'd hear the complaints from Western traders about NCR tolls and bandits running rampant throughout the lands under California's banner. Then they'd remember days like that and have plenty to say about who could protect them if NCR couldn't. Although it was clear to those Eastern traders that speaking highly of Kaisar's lands in this California place was expressly forbidden, a lot could still be said through a passing comparison of experience. Over time, traders like them would put the idea of moving east into the minds of Western caravanners, even if most of them would never admit it openly. Still, the question remained an interesting one to ponder, and many caravanners from the West found themselves inquiring about the price for that kind of protection from the barbarians of the East. The bow to Kaisar was too steep a price for many, but many others still heard that and began thinking how they'd always wanted to at least see what Arizona had to offer. As time went on and word spread, The safety promised by Legion-marked traders caused many caravans traveling through the southern Mojave to begin marking their own caravans with the bull, whether or not they were actually contracted with the Legion. After enough word went around, this idea appeared great for steering off the Mojave raiders and bandits. But doing that also taught the people of California exactly how highly the Legion valued things like honor, loyalty, and honesty. Many falsely Legion-affiliated caravans felt they were pretty crafty when legionaries appeared on the sand dunes of southern Nevada, feeling as though the bulls they painted said all they needed to. It wasn't until the decanus demands to read the contract those liars didn't have that they learned the price for feigning loyalty to Caesar. There simply wasn't much left to find after such people were discovered. The charred skeletons and tattered Legion banner said a lot to the discovering patrols from Searchlight. But the note explaining the scene usually found stuffed in the mouth of a severed head rapidly spread word that you had to honestly and legitimately be true to Caesar to reap the Legion's perks. After enough of this message seeped into the West, there was a brief period of time where a number of traders from the West openly flocked towards the crosses around Cottonwood Cove waving white flags and begging permission to speak to Caesar's local commanders. In what can only be considered a giant middle finger to the NCR scouts, rangers, and forces around Searchlight, the Legion at Cottonwood Cove gleefully allowed these traders to accept Legion contracts. If the Western traders knew that signing on with the Legion bound them to a minimum of 2 years of exclusively Eastern-based trade operations as a form of vetting, as well as a series of brutal interrogations to prevent infiltrators, many would have abandoned the idea. However, it was usually too late to turn back on the Legion's proposition when these California caravanners found themselves surrounded by crosses and terrible reminders of what defying these Eastern occupiers achieved. And so word would continue to spread about NCR incompetence amongst Western trade circles, and Cottonwood Cove had plenty of new traders sign the contracts that permitted them into the East. But NCR wised up quickly. The new objective of the NCR forces at Camp Searchlight came to eventually include the prevention of traders heading any further east. And so, the Legion terror continued in a number of ways. Whether it was through raids on California loyal caravans, savage assaults on McCarran-bound platoons, ranger skirmishes in the cliffs across southern Nevada, and even minor actions involving the abduction of locals, the forces under Legion terror were more than busy in the south. When word finally reached commanders of the terror about Caesar's approach at the start of 2280, business continued as usual. Although there was little immediate change in the objectives of this southern force, mid-2280 eventually arrived, and they had finally learned that Lord Caesar was to arrive at Fortification Hill in only another few short weeks. Upon hearing this, the commanders of the terror were content with their work for the Emperor thus far, save for Montano, who felt like there was at least one more great victory he could achieve before Lord Caesar's arrival. Despite Montano's urgency to hand over another great victory, the idea was put on something of a hold for a couple more months. Caesar had been on his way to the Mojave front for almost a year, since word was first received by the commanders at Fortification Hill, and the Emperor still had yet to arrive. There was still no word about Lord Caesar's arrival at Fortification Hill, even by September of 2280. And the forces under the terror were continually pulled this way and that regarding raids and ranger skirmishes. Being something of a side project, Montano still intended to secure some great victory in the south, but he was struggling a lot with exactly what that would be. Knowing Caesar would arrive on the front at any day, by the last week of September 2280, Montano figured that his next victory might have to happen after Caesar arrived. Even though he was still working out some of the details, Montano desired to at least have a plan in place that would garner Lord Caesar's approval if the new victory couldn't be immediately acted upon. Late 2280. Montano sat staring into the community fire pit on his sentry's end of Cottonwood Cove. The sun had just disappeared, and he felt the winds on his face while he thought beside that fire. Montano heard the sentries marching around the outpost lighting the torches, the footsteps of patrols going about their routes, and the distant weeping of several captures in the primary slave pen. Montano heard all these soft sounds as he had so many other nights, but his mind was elsewhere at the moment. Montano found himself briefly thinking about his slave women back at his lands in New Mexico, and wondered if they were fine. He hoped his recent letter to Clara was clear enough about how he wanted that armory issue fixed, but that was neither here nor there. Montano could only await the next letter that should be arriving within the next week. Montano shook himself to think about more pressing matters. He'd already run down the casualty and captures numbers with his Centuries officers an hour earlier, so that was done. Montano was exceptionally pleased with his forces and felt satisfied enough with the performance of his recruit Decani on their last raids to offer prime status to all who survived the recent raid series. The man then wondered if his favored staff officer was having some trouble with his most current directive, as it had been a little longer than usual since he'd departed. Montano decided to allow the extended allotment of time granted to Decanus Falco, taking the delay as another opportunity to think and plan. Montano was very pleased with all of his officers and thought about the one he sent Falco to fetch. If Montano's current ideas could be given the stamp of approval in tonight's meeting, the possibility of that final great victory in the South could be a reality. But there was still some time to kill while Falco was collecting the man of Montano's request. The duelist stared into that fire, thinking about all he'd gone through in this terror campaign, and about all he'd done since arriving on the west banks of the Colorado. Montano thought back to all those raids he'd been on with his recruits and veterans, against caravans, NCR platoons, NCR Rangers, etc. He tried to shrug out the most recent fight he was in with the Rangers. Recalling how he was so close to capturing two of them before it was made known to him that their interrogation was only prevented by a mercy killing, as the profligates say. As much as Montano hated the abilities of those Rangers, he also grew to respect them more and more with each time he fought them. Montano had a lot to say about the cowardice and laughable abilities of NCR infantry in combat, but those Rangers were something else. How the NCR could generate the kind of soldiers who barely know how to operate their service rifles, as well as the Rangers who've taken down whole patrols of his primes, was a mystery to almost every Legion commander on the Mojave front. Montano considered this enemy again, thinking about the ways he'd won against them, and even the ways he had to manually pry a victory from a lost engagement with them. As strong as Montano knew the Rangers were, he knew from many instances that even battlefield defeat against them can expose victories by alternate means. As Montano thought about this, his mind drifted to times in the early days of the Terror when he and his veterans had been forced into corners by those Rangers. He thought of the one occasion very early on where he and his veterans had been beaten back to that rundown house. If Montano and his legionaries hadn't discovered that local kid and left a live grenade in his hand for those pursuing Rangers, he would have felt severely humiliated ordering a retreat out the back. Montano felt that same sense of honor wash over him at memory of that Legion conscripted child sacrifice, and went on to recall moments across the campaign where he'd completed the Terror's objectives even when battlefield defeat was certain. Montano was pleased with those countless minor victories, but the recollection reminded him of his current ambitions and made him think back to the original target of his final victory in the campaign. Camp Searchlight had been a thorn in the side of the Legion at Cottonwood Cove since the start, so it was obviously the first option for any possible towns or camps to raise. Between the NCR forces at Searchlight and the Rangers deep in the mountains northwest of Cottonwood Cove, those two places accounted for nearly 90% of the action the Terror forces encountered. The Ranger station was a prime target for such a victory, but the cliffs leading to the outpost were far too treacherous and had too broad of an overview of the land to be taken in a surprise assault. Although the treacherous terrain leading to the outpost allowed for plenty of time to escape Ranger response teams, that post was more of a nuisance for Legion forces than anything. As Montano considered this, he thought again about how Searchlight had come to the same tactical conclusion. Camp Searchlight held the largest concentration of NCR forces in the South since the campaign began. Although it was mentioned that the forces there were usually too late to respond to Legion raiders operating along the roads, the place was again considered more of an annoyance than anything else. Still, the largest encampment of NCR in the region was just sitting there largely unmolested for so long that Montano decided to start investigating its strength as the weeks passed in waiting for Kaisar's arrival. Before Montano went on to ponder the true target he selected for this last victory, he thought back to the probing assault he launched on Searchlight around 2 weeks prior. This was merely a feigned assault on Camp Searchlight's perimeter. Before the assault, Montano figured that intelligence about the place's approximately 200-plus garrison was accurate, but that was only solidified when he took charge of the mock assault. This battle was initiated only to test the responsiveness of Camp Searchlight, and the defenses around the place appeared to be more than the Terror Force could deal with. It was almost certain that the 4 centuries of the Terror Force could overwhelm and take the NCR camp if executed properly, but the significant losses in doing so were also a certainty. Montano concluded that he could lead the camp's destruction, but keeping their grip on the highways and continuing the terror afterward would not be possible. Destroying the current grip of the Terror Force for one town they'd scarcely be able to defend was the kind of strategic error that led to the deaths of plenty prior Legion commanders, whether that was by their inability to hold the new ground after the enemy rallied, or by the Legion's elite commanders, for such a waste of resources depended on the circumstance. Either way, the probing assault on Searchlight revealed all that Montano needed to know. That being, the destruction of the camp would at least have to wait until more reinforcements could arrive. Because Montano wasn't quite content with Searchlight's continued existence, he did reach out to the Frumentarii of the region, asking them to relay its defensive abilities to Fortification Hill, and how the use of the Frumentarii was likely needed in order for that target to cease operations with the Legion's current strength in the south. Despite this outreach, Montano knew that Frumentarii operations at Searchlight had to await approval from the organization's head as well as Lord Caesar himself. So Montano shifted his attention towards other matters while he awaited the outcome of that western hindrance. After the probing assault on Searchlight, Montano focused his ambitions of one last victory to the region's other settlements. Most of the traffic and supplies going to Searchlight came through a town in the west called Nipton. Though the place was lightly defended, supposedly run by a degenerate local, and was in a fairly decent position to launch more raids, it was too far west. With Searchlight sitting right between Cottonwood Cove and a potential Legion outpost at Nipton, the prospect would be a logistical nightmare just waiting to fall to profligate forces across the region. Montano considered the town with the lizard monument called Novak as a possible target. But getting around the Northwestern Ranger Station with a large enough force before NCR response only meant an inevitable cutoff. Not to mention that the town would be under assault by nearby ranger stations, soldiers traveling up and down the highway, and a fortified NCR power station within a stone's throw of the settlement. No, an assault on Novak was also a poor idea. A week after the feigned assault on Searchlight, Montano had figured out his true target in the region. The town of Nelson sat north of Cottonwood Cove. This town was largely ignored by recon and raid groups, mostly because the cliffs and terrain north of Cottonwood Cove were too difficult to cross by land. Seated in something of a secluded little nook several miles north of Cottonwood Cove, the town of Nelson was largely spared from any trouble caused by the Legion's terror forces. It was because of that the few scouts who made it to the place described a calm and independent town. The strategic value in this town largely came from the limited routes into the town limit, the natural fortifications coming from the town's surrounding cliffs, as well as an almost completely clear access point to Hoover Dam. Save for a few dumpy little NCR ranger stations and observation posts in the region north of town, Nelson offered an excellent location to serve as a staging area for expanding the reach of raiding operations as well, a means of offering a possible two-pronged assault on the dam when it finally happened. With all this said, Montano had a winner. After Montano chose this town as his target, he sent more recon groups up there under cover who reported the town's independence from NCR. Montano was hesitant to strike at a Mojave town that seemed disinterested in the NCR, but that changed when he learned the town was undergoing talks about joining NCR. Apparently, the Legion's work in the south was pushing the town of Nelson more and more into the NCR's grip, as worry across the region continued to spread and sink into the minds of the southern Mojave locals. If only the people of Nelson knew the consequences of asking NCR for help, they might have been spared what Montano intended for them. Montano still intended to have the town taken regardless of their affiliation with NCR, but formally allying with NCR meant that an extra brutal method would have to be used on its populace in order to teach the lesson of what defiance brings. Montano was still working out the final details of his plan to take Nelson, but by this point, he had enough of a plan to approach his colleagues in the terror about it. when he mentioned to Aurelius and the others about the benefit of that town's potential access to Hoover Dam. He removed the map from his bag just to double-check. This was perfect, provided the NCR didn't establish a new fortified front line with the fall of Nelson. The possibilities that came with an outpost at Nelson guaranteed approval. Montano would see that the town was conquered, and Legion territory on the west side of the river would be that much closer to Hoover Dam. This tightening of the noose around NCR's neck was the perfect means of handing Caesar one last victory before his arrival. The Centurion just finished rounding out some of those last details when Falco had finally stepped up to the fire with the man he'd been tasked to fetch. Falco said to his Primus, "Centurion Montano, I have brought Prime Decanus Dead Sea before you." The Prime officer next to Falco said, "Ave, my Centurion, true to Caesar." Montano stood from his seat, gave his hail, and asked Decanus Dead Sea, "Do you know why I ordered you before me?" The Decani both saluted Montano's rise in Dead Sea, said, "My Centurion's cause for my summons is unknown." Montano looked to Falco and then back at Dead Sea before saying, "I've had my eye on you for a while, Decanus, ever since you were assigned to my century. Do you remember why I gifted you that blade?" The Decanus stood himself even more upright as he answered, "I have served Caesar with all my breast since he pulled me from the wilderness of Utah. My Centurion has since deemed me worthy of such an honorable blade due to my servitude during the fall of the Sundogs." "Exactly," said Montano flatly before catching the young officer's eyes. The Sundogs were a useful auxilia throughout southern Arizona and New Mexico, but such names should be forgotten. Dead Sea was about to apologize for mentioning the name of a tribe his Centurion didn't deem worthy of remembrance. However, Montano added, "As exceptional as your actions were in that short campaign, you've continued to impress me in your raids and reconnaissance all across this current campaign. So many triumphs should not go unrewarded." "True to Caesar, my Centurion," said Dead Sea as Falco glanced at his commander's face, feeling only slightly envious of Dead Sea's praise. Montano went on, "With experience being such a detrimental issue since the assimilation campaign, as well as this terror campaign, I want you to be one of my veterans." He paused, allowing Dead Sea to say, "My Centurion does me a great honor." The younger officer immediately dropped to his knee beside the fire, and Montano accepted the glory before wordlessly ordering the officer to meet his gaze. Dead Sea looked up into the eyes of Montano before the Centurion said, "It's time you earned a means of new glory, but before I grant you veterancy, I am tasking you with one last assignment." The officer remained in waiting only for Montano to add, "Come, rise, and follow me." Dead Sea rose at the gesture of Montano, and the Centurion motioned for Falco to follow as well. The three proceeded away from the fire and towards the outpost's main structure, the domicile of Aurelius of Phoenix. Along the dirt paths they went following the torches. As they approached the stairs on the other side of the building, Montano noticed something unusual happening in the shadow of the building. But Montano was on a mission, so he subtly ordered Falco to investigate while he continued on with Dead Sea. Falco only briefly thought that his Centurion was trying to dismiss him for private counsel with the veteran Decanus to be, but hadn't been given the order to dismiss himself afterward. So Falco went to investigate the abnormal situation happening in the shadow of the outpost's main structure while Montano and Dead Sea went up the stairs. Atop the balcony overlooking the west, Montano ordered Dead Sea into the domicile of Aurelius of Phoenix while Montano waited. The second he heard Falco engage the situation below, he had all the confidence in the world in the right hand of his staff and proceeded inside. Decanus Dead Sea stood in the middle of the room with two other Centurions of the Terror surrounding the desk of Centurion Aurelius. When Montano entered, he took his place beside the Prime Decanus as Aurelius asked cordially, "Centurion Montano, I must inquire about this Prime Commander you've sent me." After Montano, Dead Sea, and all the other Centurions in the room gave their hails to Caesar, Montano made himself more comfortable in the room while Dead Sea remained in place. "This is the officer of mine who will be launching the assault on Nelson," said Montano, as he pulled a chair up to the desk. The other Centurions remained standing around the seated Aurelius and his cluttered desk as though they were interrupted by Montano. However, being the most senior Centurion in the room, they allowed Montano's interruption without protest, and the statement itself made Aurelius take another look at the Prime before he asked Montano, "Any particular reason you're trusting a Prime Decanus with something like that?" Centurion Montano? Experience, was Montano's only answer before adding, I will be taking secondary command of the assault myself, but I would like to take this time to receive your input about the plan. Qualifications? Asked Aurelius as he and the other centurions looked over the young Decanus. Immediately, Montano said, this officer was pulled from the Great Salt Lake by Caesar's explorer teams in 2273. He served adequately as a recruit in the Brotherhood campaign until being granted a Decanus title in 2276, as well as reassignment to my century at the start of the Auxilia campaigns that same year. The Decanus showed remarkable skill and brutality, leading soldiers of my recruit ranks to victory on the, what were they? The Sundogs campaign? Dead Sea didn't physically nod, but Montano felt the telepathic nod of affirmation and went on, his actions were remarkable enough for me to bestow a gifted blade upon him. Presently, his leadership of my prime forces throughout the Terror have been exceptional enough for me to pend his further veterancy on final remarkable victory. A victory at Nelson. The centurions all looked Dead Sea over until they had their fill. Aurelius finally said to the lower officer, Decanus, remove your blade. In an instant, Dead Sea had removed his gifted blade and extended it with both hands for Centurion Aurelius to observe. After several moments of study, Aurelius looked to Montano. I was under the impression he'd received a more extravagant or custom blade for his renown you describe. Montano glanced at the dull and rusty blood-coated blade that looked almost identical to every other machete to come from the Circle Junction forges. Montano had forgotten that, and caught the eyes of the centurions as he said, supplies were somewhat scarce on that campaign if I recall correctly. A grin grew on the faces of all the centurions until Montano looked to Dead Sea and said, explain. Dead Sea had no idea what exactly he was supposed to explain, but he began speaking regardless in traditional Legion fashion. This gifted blade from my Centurion has split the heads and opened the throats of countless savages in battles under my Centurion. Since Centurion Montano brought his forces into the West on Caesar's demand, this blade has already required an innumerable number of hours on the grindstone after dulling with each dead profligate soldier. He stopped, and all the centurions nodded wordlessly, admiring the servile tone of the young officer, but still unnerved by the overall plainness of the blade. Montano, too, felt the blade was inadequate for such a remarkable soldier with such a short record, but remembered how literally anything given to a recruit Decanus by their centurion was its own supreme honor. Montano knew that if he presented the man with one of his spare bootlaces as a reward accompanying the raise to prime, that bootlace would have strangled the life out of countless profligates in the hands of this young commander. All the centurions knew this as well, but before moving on with Montano's plan and ordering the Decanus to sheath his plain blade, Aurelius asked Dead Sea, at least tell me you named Centurion Montano's gifted blade. Without any hesitation, Dead Sea answered, I have named this blade Liberator, for it was Lord Caesar who liberated me from my prior pathetic existence on the shores of the Great Salt Lake, and it is with this blade that I seek to continue liberating profligates from their wretched existences. All the centurions nodded approvingly at the Decanus's answer, and Aurelius said, very well. Montano motioned for Dead Sea to sheath his blade, and he did just that as Aurelius said to Montano. So, you have a plan for dealing with Nelson? Please elaborate, and we shall be honored to offer our input on the matter. Before going on, Aurelius took one last notice of the Decanus before asking offhandedly, before you proceed, I'm curious as to why you're having Dead Sea in particular lead the operation as a means of experience when your Decanus Falco is of a more proper veterancy for such a task. Montano had thought about that for a long time, and though he would have preferred to answer that question when Falco was in the room to hear it, he knew that didn't matter. So, Montano replied simply, I prefer veteran Decanus Falco in his current position. He has been the right hand of my staff almost since he was a boy fresh from the Circle Junction camps. The Decanus Falco has fought remarkably for me all throughout the entire Meat Grinder campaign, and in innumerable ways up to the present day where he currently shows unparalleled competence amongst all my Contubernium Decani and staff officers. He remains my most trusted officer, and he's already under the eye of the Frumentarii for a possible raise to Centurion. His becoming a Centurion would put him out of my command, which is something I cannot permit at the moment. If he were to lead the victory at Nelson, That would assuredly send him to Fortification Hill for promotion and a new charge. Aurelius said, "Unless the victory at Nelson is enough to raise you to elite Centurion, then you would be allowed to have Centurions of your choice in your personal staff." Montano thought about this idea, remembering that one elite Centurion he personally met on several occasions. Then, he remembered the particular Centurion that Elite trusted so dearly and shook the memory of that guy out of his mind. No, Montano would not be making Elite Centurion anytime soon. Not only were there no new openings that he knew about, but Montano knew that that guy would likely achieve the title of Elite sooner. Regardless of Montano's lengthier combat record when compared to that guy's. Yes, Montano had heard rumor that Aileron was in charge of operations at Fortification Hill, and although Aileron's work on the Mojave front he heard about had been admirable in Montano's eyes, Montano was content with where he was, quietly serving Caesar as best he could in the south. So, Falco leaving Montano's command was too impossible an idea to imagine, and Montano elaborated all he cared to for his audience when he said, "My decision stands. Dead Sea is to take charge of the operation at Nelson." At that, the Centurions around the table acknowledged, and before Montano could proceed with his plan to take back Nelson, the door opened. Dead Sea stood in place, but the Centurions' attention was turned to see Falco entering. After Montano's head of staff greeted and hailed the room, Falco took his place beside Dead Sea and was asked by Montano, "Did you settle the disturbance in the darkness of this building's exterior?" "Yes, my Centurion," said Falco militarily before elaborating. "It was only another capture who abused his work detail privileges to vandalize this building." Aurelius interrupted. Again, Falco met the eyes of Centurion Aurelius, then went on for his commander. "The capture is currently in chains, isolated from the others. And I have dispatched a team to flog the guilty man with 60 lashes in the morning under my Centurion's supervision." Montano took this in and then asked his second, "Was it at least spelled right this time?" "Negative," said Falco before squashing the worries of all the Centurions present. "I have instructed the perpetrator on the correct grammar for his dissolute words, and the creature is currently under the standing protocol. The capture was given the proper allotment of paper as well as ink, and has from now until sunrise to transcribe the correct verbiage Romani ite domum 400 times. Should the vandal succeed, he will have saved himself from crucifixion and only suffer at the whipping post before being left with the standard order to not do it again." "Excellent," said Montano, the whole situation making him scoff to himself. "Aiunt domus? We should go to the house?" A brief silence ensued while Aurelius and the other Centurions also swore under their breath about the ignorance of dissolutes who didn't know proper Latin. With the issue outside dealt with, Falco stood by but was eventually authorized by Montano to get a little more comfortable while Dead Sea remained in his place. At that, Montano began to relay his plans for the fall of Nelson, turning to Dead Sea when necessary about the particular details the veteran-to-be should bear in mind. There was a lot to the plan, but the plan basically had Dead Sea carrying out the plan itself, while Montano remained in the rear to observe and take charge of any unexpected issues to arise. With the cliffs north to Nelson being essentially impassable, Montano spoke about carrying out the plan in the late evening via amphibious means. Montano's force would move up the river in boats, and the extra time allotment allowed for the battling of the current. Pulling his map out of his satchel, Montano showed the other Centurions the site where he and his sentry would disembark. From there, the force would move under the cover of night, silencing any hostile wildlife without the use of firearms until each section reached its position on the south end of town. From there, a three-pronged attack would be launched with each group driving any of the town's militia defenders towards the cliffs down to the Colorado. If Mars favored the night, and if the attack was savage enough in its rapid execution, Montano explained he may not need to butcher the whole town. The Legion would occupy the defensible town and teach the people of Nelson what attempts to ally with NCR will achieve. He elaborated that the situation might change if there were any delays in the plan. The sparing of the town predominantly depended on whether or not there were NCR troops stationed there. But that didn't seem likely since the town was still in talks with NCR, according to the most recent intel. The plan was a perfect one, its quality being announced by the Centurions of the room, who didn't have a lot to add other than contemplative faces and regular nods of affirmation as Montano spoke. Excellent, Montano thought as he finished relaying the plan. The fall of Nelson could come in a matter of days if we organize quickly, and a fortified position at Nelson could make for another means of advance on Hoover Dam our emperor can utilize upon his arrival. Just then, the door to the room opened once more, and in came an explorer who immediately greeted and hailed the room. The explorer wasn't one of Montano's, but the scout identified himself as one of Aurelius when Centurion Aurelius ordered the new arrival. "What is it, Flavius?" The explorer called Flavius placed a fist over his heart and answered, "My Primus, I have just received word that Lord Caesar has arrived at Fortification Hill earlier this afternoon." As glad as Montano was at hearing the news that Lord Caesar had finally arrived on the Mojave front, he knew that his plans for a great victory to hand over were instantly squashed, even though the assault would now be delayed until getting the Emperor's stamp of approval. Montano knew this was probably for the best, since getting Lord Caesar's personal go-ahead on this idea would come with its own recognition and additional honor. Needless to say, Montano was not surprised and was already compiling the papers he removed from his satchel when Aurelius turned to him and said, "Centurion Montano, this plan will have to wait. Hand over your plans to me and I'll have them dispatched to the fort immediately with the first boat out in the morning." Without a word, Montano handed over his detailed plans to Aurelius, who then ordered his explorer to take them east across the river as soon as the sun rose. The explorer left the room, and although Montano was still glad his emperor had arrived, he remained dismayed by the fact that he would have to wait. Montano hoped that the wait for approval would be a short one, and would not allow the time for the NCR to fortify the independent town with an official garrison. Either way, Montano knew that regardless the circumstance, he would continue the terror in the south as well as possible. But for now, Montano could only wait. Montano sat in on the rest of the meeting between Centurion Aurelius and the others, but eventually dismissed Dead Sea, as he'd been standing there long enough without use. Montano took note of some of the details in the Centurion meeting that pertained to him, but it was mostly outlining new objectives and slave counts from the other Terra Centurions. Eventually, Montano dismissed himself and motioned for Falco to come along. Montano stepped outside with his favorite staff officer and stood atop the platform looking into the west with the moon high above. Eventually, Montano felt it was time to retire for the evening and came to this realization when Decanus Falco asked Montano, "Is there anything else my Centurion requires of me this evening?" A slight grin appeared and disappeared on Montano's face at the question. He wondered to himself why Falco was the only soldier under his command that he permitted to ask questions, until his mind flooded with memories of the brutal combat he'd seen over the decades at recollection of the news about his emperor's current proximity. This made him grin more as he looked into the west before he unconsciously found his attention turning north. Nelson would fall with the blessing of Lord Caesar, and the Legion would encircle Hoover Dam, while Caesar leads them to victory. As Montano thought about the bright future and how that brightness stemmed from the burning of profligate towns, Montano finally replied to Decanus Falco, with a mind captured by all those instances of pathetic defiance he'd seen on this campaign of terror. "I only have one last order for you, Decanus Falco." Falco waited, and Montano shifted his focus from the north down to his feet. Still thinking about the pathetic resistance the Mojave offered to the forces of the terror, he said to Falco, "Come now, lead me to the site of the most recent vandalism incident." Falco said stern and militarily, "Right away, my Centurion." The two proceeded down the steps to mock the improper Latin phrase essentially telling the Legion, or people called Romans, to go to the house. A crew of slaves would paint over the vandals' work in the morning, but Montano, Falco, and every other legionary or officer under the terror knew that another defiant phrase would replace it at some point. Words were all that the people of the southern Mojave had to offer, and although the NCR forces of the region had been their own hindrance, he knew that pleads for mercy. And simple words were all they had now to defy the Legion as Caesar's victory crept closer by the second. Caesar had finally arrived on the front, and the message of the terror would only spread further with Caesar at the helm. Aileron Part 2. Early 2281. As Aileron stood on the shores of Lake Mead, his eyes were fixed on that little dot sitting nearly in the center of it. He'd been told by scouts and raiding parties who returned from trips across the lake that the strange object is actually a series of shacks and rafts making up what could be considered a town. Why anyone would build a town in the center of the lake was beyond him or any legionary who saw it, but the whole thing was still interesting nonetheless. If interesting was the correct word. Eventually, Aileron pulled his binoculars up and tried to see the supposed aquatic town more clearly. No use. The place was still too hard to detail through the heat haze. He considered drafting a request to establish a Legion observation post on that flotilla, but then remembered that other detail the scouts and returning raiders reported. It was again too far for Aileron to see, but he could easily believe it when he heard the boat town was infested by those lake lurk, monsters who probably killed the inhabitants before they could get their unique little settlement up and running. This led Aileron to the thought of lake lurks themselves and how much of a minor nuisance they'd been since the establishment of Fortification Hill. Particularly a burden for the soldiers inhabiting the main encampment around the lake, they still weren't too big a threat when it came down to it. Aileron thought about those creatures even more, and how those humanoid-looking amphibious monsters were truly quite terrifying. No legionary to arrive at Fortification Hill had seen creatures quite like them, even those who'd seen the bizarre and monstrous wildlife across the Colorado wilderness. Aileron himself preferred the deathclaws, Gila beasts, and giant sand scorpions across Arizona and New Mexico to the rather ugly appearance of these Mojave lake lurks. Luckily, however, lake lurks tended to steer clear of the lakeside encampment, probably due to an aversion to people in such high concentrations. Aileron supposed that the only upside to those repulsive creatures was that their meat wasn't all that bad, and was actually quite good. The regular lake lurk that washed up dead on the shores of the encampment made for some excellent sustenance, with each one offering enough meat for at least 2 contubernia of legionaries. He thought a bit more about those creatures, and the bizarre stories he'd heard from soldiers crossing the lake who spoke of the occasional run-in with them. Lake lurks weren't normally encountered by legionaries in their boats directly, as it's been shown that lake lurks were usually most deadly on the shorelines. Aileron had heard that lake lurks were terrifying if they were close enough to start shredding whoever approached their grounds. But the strangest thing came from the odd account from a legionary who survived a sonic blast from those creatures. Although there wasn't a servant of Caesar alive who knew what a sonic blast truly was or meant, the occurrence was made known by Mojave locals and captures, and the word seemed an adequate explanation as any for those who survived the lake lurk's ranged attack. Legionaries who survived a lake lurk's sonic attack speak of an enormous screeching sound immediately followed by an intense ringing in the ears, a severe concussion that lasts several days, and sometimes even temporary psychosis. Those who didn't survive were said to simply drop dead as if the soldier had the life sucked out of him. Aileron concluded many times over the weeks and months on the front that he disliked lake lurks and was thankful that they largely steered clear of the encampment beneath Fortification Hill. Still, though, his mind went back to their use to the Legion as he remembered the countless times he saw a patrol from an isolated watchpost carting one of their giant slippery corpses to the fire pits and butcher stations across the encampment. Aileron had a particular disgust for the creatures he would never openly admit, but he still had to admit to himself that the meat from those amphibious abominations was good. At thought of lake lurk meat, Aileron found himself thinking again about the camp's food stores and almost immediately shrugged the thought out of his mind. This wasn't due to any issues with supply, for that had been handled months ago by the independent trader arrangement. And a recent miracle where around 30 dead lake lurks washed up on the shores of the encampment. No, the food stores were fine. In fact, they were too fine. Aileron had almost no real issues to handle anymore, no real battles to prepare for. And idleness makes all soldiers of Caesar essentially morph into bubbling cauldrons of rage, just waiting to be poured out on the proper Legion-approved target. Aileron considered how this building rage in the hearts of the legionaries across Fortification Hill was possibly intentional on the part of Caesar. Perhaps the battle for the dam was finally coming, and Caesar wanted Aileron and all the others of the fort's garrison as angry as possible beforehand. Upon considering that possibility, Aileron personally felt it was only a matter of hours before the second battle at the dam would commence, even though his heart told him it was still a long ways off. Aileron again shrugged the thoughts out of his head, and instead raised his eyes from the dot in the center of the lake to the patch of greenery on the distant shore. Aileron heard that place on the northwest shore Just past Las Vegas Bay was a profligate installation called Camp Golf, and it had been a decent counter to Legion forces operating on the north end of the lake since Aileron first arrived on the front. However, it was currently the third month of 2281, and the northern operations were steadily declining as the terror forces in the south worked. The lack of action in the north and lake region had only decreased more and more since Caesar arrived in the final quarter of 2280. As Aileron studied the distant NCR camp and considered what that reported grass looked like up close, Aileron raised his binoculars up with hopes of seeing something new. Just as expected, Aileron could not make out just about anything beyond the heat haze save for the blurry outline of the camp's main headquarters in a derelict resort. Unable to make out any enemy positions, patrols, or incoming traffic, Aileron lowered his binoculars in defeat. He was still waiting on something he thought would be potentially exciting, but even the best news to come from the pending task seemed to do little for Aileron's spirit still battling the idleness. So, in an effort to kill even more time and not think about the memories he loathed considering, Aileron walked along the shores of the lakeside encampment, observing his surroundings for the 10,000th time. The Centurion walked on just as a raiding party pulled up to the shore before him. The legionaries at the bow leaped out and dragged their vessels a few feet further inland before the crews hastily got out carting their injured brothers and whipping the new captive profligates to stand up, only briefly stopping to salute Aileron and offer their hails before continuing on. Aileron looked back at the sprawling camp, seeing the endless turning of grindstones, the shore patrols, the slaves bringing goods down to the camp, those centurions leading sparring exercises, and those legionaries roasting giant lake lurk corpses over the shoreside fire pits. None of it was anything new to Aileron. This was what Aileron saw every day since Kaiser's arrival, and though the sight of so many legionaries ready for the fall of Hoover Dam was inspiring at first, it had already lost its touch after so much inaction. Before Aileron sought to consider all that was really on his mind, he distracted himself again by turning to the head of this incoming raid party. The boat raiders were busy escorting the captured profligates off the boats, their feet splashing in the shallow water before the veteran decanus in charge of this group felt Aileron's eyes on the back of his helmet. Turning to the Centurion, the decanus said, "Ave, Centurion, true to Caesar." Aileron hailed right back and asked the officer, "What was your objective and the result of this raid, decanus?" "My Centurion, I have returned successfully from a raiding objective on the north end of this lake under orders to capture some profligates based out of the refugee camp known locally as Bitter Springs." Aileron was well familiar with the NCR-led refugee camp in the north from his days in charge of Fortification Hill, back when he was far more informed on matters of the Mojave. However, he'd never heard from anyone who'd been there on a combat directive. Back before Caesar arrived, Aileron was in too high a position to regularly hear from lowly raid commanders. Not anymore, though. Aileron had lost a lot of responsibilities since the Emperor showed up. This memory and all the disappointment it entailed prompted Aileron to ask the decanus simply, "How was that? Encounter much opposition?" Aileron thought about the injured legionaries who were the first ones carted off the boats and thought he counted 4. The injured were already halfway to the nearest healing enclosures in the camp proper, and Aileron's interest in the raiding commander was satisfied as the decanus explained. "The state of defense in the camp itself is pathetic. The profligates in that garrison almost grant us permission to take who we please." "That so?" asked Aileron plainly, thinking once again about the injured. "Yes, of course, my Centurion. The camp remains an excellent source of easily obtained captures. That's not to say the profligate soldiers nearby are." The decanus and Aileron were both interrupted by the nearby struggle. As the captured refugees filed off the longboat in chains, one of the captures separate from the others was putting up a loud struggle. This noteworthy capture was not dressed like one of the dirt-covered refugees. This one was wearing tan khaki pants, a light collared shirt, and an empty leg holster with the standout being the little bear insignias on her collars. Aileron and the veteran decanus silently watched the profligate captive struggle wildly in the grip of 2 veterans and a recruit. How it was possible for 3 soldiers of Caesar to struggle with their grip on a woman almost made Aileron reprimand the legionaries involved right there, until the profligate female soldier managed to throw the recruit behind her over her back. Before the veterans could whip out their guns and execute the woman, she stomped on the head of the recruit and set her arms down with the words, "Now I'll comply." carried calmly in the wind straight to Alaron's ears. From there, the woman calmly stepped off the boat and onto the shore as the veterans pressed their guns to her head and neck as she proceeded slowly towards the camp. Alaron just realized he let out an audible chuckle when the woman took down the recruit. But his face contorted back to its usual seriousness when he saw two nearby primes hop in the boat to remove the recruit's body. Alaron never learned if the recruit was knocked out after getting his head curb-stomped by the woman, or if he was killed. Either way, the woman stepped further inland, following distantly behind the other captures as Alaron turned to the decanus. "You were saying something about profligate soldiers near the refugee camp?" The decanus and Alaron continued to watch the woman shuffle closer as the veteran decanus replied, "The camp itself is an easy source of slaves, but the rangers at nearby stations remain a source of some bother." "Halt," said Alaron plainly with an extra hint of intrigue. "Is that who the woman is? Did you and your force manage to capture a ranger?" "A woman ranger, unfortunately, but a capable one at that." Alaron let out a scoff in near disbelief as he studied the woman further. The decanus went and added, "The last of my directive requires that I report in with my Centurion Hatirius. Might the Centurion know where my commander is at this time? I am also to report to Centurion Alaron of the 101st as well to process the captures. I cannot say where Centurion Hatirius is, for I do not know, but I am Centurion Alaron. So you may leave the captures with my staff in the northwest quarter of the camp. You'll see my century's banner and someone will come along to handle your captures," said Alaron, only briefly disappointed that he was no longer recognized on sight by everyone at the fort. Alaron figured this veteran must have been one of the soldiers under a commander that Caesar brought with his arrival. Either way, the decanus said, "Excellent. I request your pardon for failing to recognize you, Centurion Alaron." "Not needed," said Alaron flatly before gesturing for the decanus to carry on. The raid officer barked at the head of the line of captures. 101st, Northwest Quarter. A soldier at the head acknowledged from the distance and continued the captive train further into camp. Alaron finally met the look of that decanus and dismissed him with the order to carry on and find his Centurion. The veteran departed, leaving Alaron alone on the shore, save for the veterans and the captive ranger who was being made to move very slowly. Suddenly, Alaron turned around, saw the ranger still inching towards the camp proper between two guns, and shouted, "Ranger!" The party stopped, and the veterans turned their prisoner around and walked toward Alaron, who remained in place. When the ranger was halted before Alaron, he studied her fair complexion, brown hair, brown eyes, and unwavering countenance for a long moment. Watching the muscles in her face twist ever so subtly to bring something to the surface, Alaron knew the first question he asked of the ranger would be met by a spit in his eye. Seeing this, Alaron smiled and stated to her, "I saw your defiance. Such remarkable skill, I must admit." The ranger was ready to do what Alaron anticipated at any moment. She was waiting so meticulously for the cue to spit in this Centurion's eye that she didn't even perceive it when Alaron removed his 10mm from its holster. Still capturing her whole attention with his eyes alone, Alaron said very coolly, "Think that attitude will last the week, Ranger?" Immediately, he fired a shot into the ranger's foot, making her let out a tremendous cry in pain. The spit she readied for Centurion Alaron poured down her mouth and onto the sands with the release of that cry. She struggled even more in the grip of those veterans, but the pain in her foot was too much. The ranger collapsed but was held upright by the veterans, and Alaron gave the motion for them to carry on as he said, "Once this profligate is secured, go fetch Siri, that healer slave atop the hill. Have her see to the ranger." The veterans acknowledged the command while turning their prisoner around to carry on. The ranger continued to fight back sobs of agonizing pain, the ability to remain tough disappearing in an instant with the unexpected bullet shattering her right foot. Alaron watched the bloody footsteps trail further towards the camp until he finally turned back to the lake, knowing the new head of the slave healers would fix her up well enough to begin life as a slave already, with the knowledge of what her masters were capable of inflicting. Later that day. "So, the tunnels lead into the dam for sure?" asked Centurion Alaron. Instantly, the head of his explorer team said, "Yes, my Centurion. We believe so. The tunnels we followed appeared to align perfectly with the blueprints of the dam you permitted us to view. Unfortunately, our further exploration was prevented by what appeared to be a partial collapse about a half-mile into the intake system. The explorer was left at that, his attention turning to Aileron, who was searching for something on his command desk. Aileron shifted the stacks of documents and folders around for a moment until he found what he was looking for. Aileron removed the blueprint of the dam he'd been entrusted to possess and spread it out before the explorer. Approximately, where was the collapse section? Asked Aileron. The explorer studied the blueprint for a moment, tracing the route he followed from the excavated Arizona side intake pipe down to about where he and the other explorers encountered the obstruction. Finally, the explorer answered, I believe it was about right here, my Centurion. We had just passed the section marked 86A when we came upon the obstruction. All right, said Aileron, as he sat back and thought for a moment. His eyes eventually drifted to Gabriella, who sat on her cot waiting for an order. Finally, Aileron looked back at the explorer and asked, Did you encounter anything else in the pipe system? Perhaps any unlabeled doors bearing the emblem of the Lucky 38? That's a negative, Centurion Aileron. The pipe system appeared exactly as the schematics here show. The explorer saw his Centurion stuck in thought. Aileron glanced up at the scout and wordlessly permitted him to speak what was on his mind. The scout added, Am I safe to assume that my Centurion is looking for an alternate means of access to the subterranean facility beneath Fortification Hill? Aileron let loose a long sigh. That was the secondary hope of this intake system exploration. He paused in thought for a second before saying to the room itself, Still though, confirming the intake tunnel's access into the dam's heart is most excellent to hear, minus the obstruction. As glad as Aileron was to hear the tunnel expedition did in fact provide a back door into the dam, Aileron was still slightly more focused on the lack of an alternate means into the weather station's secret mystery facility. Aileron vented to himself. Lord Caesar attempted all the means of opening the weather station's interior door that I did, yet still nothing. I was also finally permitted last week to attempt its opening by placing an Urus in the circular slot on the terminal system, but even that achieved nothing. The explorer remained silent, unable to add anything to his commander's frustrations. Aileron knew this, and so the immediate silence ended when Aileron had collected himself enough. Aileron finally ended this check-in with his personal scouts by saying, In any regard, you've done as I require. I want you and your party to return to those tunnels, get one last sweep, and draft up a report. Make an assessment of the blockage and get me an estimate on the number of slaves you think will be required to clear that obstruction. I'll hand your report to Lucius in my next meeting with him, and we'll proceed from there. Of course, Centurion Aileron. Right away, said the explorer as he turned to exit the enclosure. Wait, said Aileron flatly, making the explorer halt in about face. Aileron tossed the explorer a small sack of Legion coins. As the sack landed in the explorer's hands, Aileron said, For your work in the tunnels, distribute the currency between yourself and your team. The explorer was left slightly bewildered at being paid for executing the orders of his Centurion. This made the explorer answer astutely, Compensation for such a task is by no means required, my Centurion. I know, said Aileron to his desk, more focused on the papers he was reading than the explorer's continuing presence. The explorer lingered in place for a moment, believing there was perhaps an additional directive until Aileron finally gestured for the soldier to shoo as he continued reading the papers in front. The explorer departed and Aileron continued to read and compile his current intel documents on the tunnel assignment. He did not know exactly when the next meeting with Lucius the head Praetorian would be, but the updated intel was already compiled and ready for relay less than 2 minutes after the explorer departed. Now it was just waiting on the final notes to come from the explorer's second sweep through. Aileron sat at his desk with plenty to do for all that clutter on his desk, but none of that seemed to matter. As much as Aileron had to do, matters of Fortification Hill were operating as smoothly as ever. The fort was operating at this time like more of a city than anything. It was plenty populated, there were a lot of people moving to and fro, a lot of people doing a lot of different things, but they weren't going anywhere. This dreaded feeling of idleness sank even deeper into Aileron once more. Before Aileron could get too lost in his idle thoughts, he felt the eyes of Gabriella on the side of his head, but was temporarily more focused on the broader situation he was dealing with. The question crossed Aileron's mind once more. The question that had become more and more frequent in his mind since Kaiser's arrival. Why are we still sitting here? Alaron, as well as the other centurions of the fort, were under the impression that Kaiser's arrival meant the nearly immediate assault on Hoover Dam. That ended up not being the case. Despite all the work Alaron had done for the front, all the intel he received, relayed, and acted upon, all of that put the Legion in a place that would ensure victory at the dam the second that Kaiser arrived. However, the waiting only continued. Even with Kaiser's arrival at the top of Fortification Hill, the only thing that really changed for Alaron was his position and that rapidly diminishing amount of responsibilities. Alaron was no longer the direct relay between the Frumentarii and Lord Kaiser, and that meant that Alaron had finally returned to the days and position of just another battlefield centurion. Yes, Alaron went from acting commander of the entire front and defender of Arizona down to head administrator of Fortification Hill. As illustrious as the title may sound for a commander of the Legion's headquarters on this most concentrated front, it was actually one that left him with almost nothing to do. Alaron saw to the slaves and captures of incoming raid groups. He oversaw the armories and food stores. He was the point of contact with supply runners or independent merchants. And he was occasionally given the odd task, like investigating the recently excavated tunnels. Although even the odd task was not as exciting since Alaron again was not nearly as informed about matters of the front as he was only a few months prior. Alaron was able to make guesses about the reason for these tasks, like Alaron assumed that the tunnels into the dam were a possible strategy for gutting the dam inside out. Although Alaron couldn't quite fathom why they would need the tunnels when the forces occupying Fortification Hill were nearly doubled what was used at the dam the first time. All the while, the terror forces of the South dispersed NCR forces all across the Mojave, without even mentioning the Legion's allies in the region who'd been performing their own roles excellently. No, there was something else. There was something else to Kaiser's strategy in this campaign that Alaron was unfortunately too low on the ladder now to know. Even with progress going at the rate it was in the South, the Legion was already in the place to seize the Vegas region at any moment. Although Alaron didn't know what they were for sure, Kaiser still had several operations in the works that just required more time. And Alaron could only carry on and wait even more for that coming day when they'd march west across the dam. In the meantime, Alaron was busy leading the operations of Fortification Hill from his lowly little command tent in the midst of the lakeside encampment. Alaron tried once more to take some pride in his official position, but then reminded himself how his current title really just meant that he had to carry out all the operations and oversee the matters that the Emperor simply couldn't be bothered with. One of the big things that ate away at Alaron was the fact that he didn't even get to report to the Emperor himself. Despite all he'd done in the early days of the front, and despite him being in charge of operations for the fortress that the Emperor was currently occupying, Alaron still was not permitted to see or report to Lord Kaiser. Alaron's position had him only reporting to the Praetorian Lucius, who he knew and admired. Although reporting to Lucius wasn't a bad thing, given Alaron's familiarity with the man. The idea of still not being able to even meet the Emperor once again made Alaron feel as though everything he'd done on this front was done without recognition or even notice. Before Alaron could begin considering why the idea of recognition or reporting to Kaiser mattered to him at all when it hadn't in decades prior, he again shook the thought out of his head. Finally, in an effort to distract himself, Alaron turned to the source of that burning feeling on the side of his head. Alaron met the eyes of Gabriella, who instinctively lowered them in an instant. Alaron studied her face, briefly considering how well she's been aging. A year or two past 40 and still, Gabriella appears to remain a prime subject of breeding, Alaron thought as he again put off the idea of having her rear his child. This too was a thought Alaron preferred not to think about, for it was something he concluded years ago would happen after the taking of Vegas. Finally, Alaron acted on the effort to distract himself, saying to her, "Is there something on your mind, Gabriella?" Alaron already knew what was on her mind, and that was concern. Concern for himself. He just wanted to hear her admit it. As Alaron expected, Gabriella met the eyes of Alaron and began expressing her concern for him, how he's appeared unusually discontent as of late, how he's been even less able to sleep, etc. Alaron heard the gist of what she was saying, but hearing her speak naturally made his mind go elsewhere. Eventually, Aileron realized her words were by no means the distraction he wanted. Just as he realized this, the Legion came to Aileron's rescue when his Centuries Vexillarius stepped into the tent. Gabriella cut what she was saying short, and the standard-bearer gave his hail before saying, "My Centurion, I have been instructed to relay a message to you about an urgent matter." "What is it?" Aileron asked, taking the tone of his Vexillarius to mean the assault on the dam was about to occur. Aileron was disappointed when the soldier simply explained, "The primary gate sentries require your say on a particular matter regarding the traitor Dale Barton." Aileron let out another frustrated sigh and then thanked the soldier before dismissing him. The Centurion stood himself up, glanced at Gabriella, and said, "You may continue expressing your concerns when I return." Then he departed. 30 minutes later. "Why on earth would you consider this broken piece of ancient trash to be a gift to Lord Caesar?" asked Aileron coolly, his inner rage only appearing in a whisper behind the words. The traitor stammered, It's just missing the firing mechanism. Should be a simple enough fix if you find the part. And it didn't occur to you to perhaps find a replacement firing mechanism while you were at the source of this howitzer?" questioned Aileron, as he took another look at the giant old-world artillery piece sitting surrounded by over a dozen servants of Caesar on standby. The traitor answered, "I gotta admit that I'm not sure what a firing mechanism for one of these cannons looks like." Aileron accidentally said out loud, "And you think my explorers will have a better idea?" A momentary silence ensued after that. The slaves and soldiers around the howitzer turned, and the traitor stood in paralysis. Aileron took one deep inhale and smiled insidiously at the traitor, completely collected. "Dale, I'm sure you understand that my soldiers and scouts, who I'm sure you know come from all kinds of savage backgrounds, who use blades to kill, who still occasionally struggle with the English language due to their tribal backgrounds, will have even more difficulty salvaging a replacement firing mechanism than you or your scavers will. So before I dispatch my runners all the way to Yuma searching for a mechanical instrument they will not ever be able to identify, I'll ask you very kindly to go and fetch it yourself." Dale remained sweating before the terrifying Centurion. Finally, when Dale understood that Aileron was done speaking, he said to the Centurion, "Sure, I'd be happy to return with one. Could be a while before I'm down in Yuma again, but I'll definitely add one to my list." Aileron briefly considered shooting Dale in the head right there, but he didn't want to have to explain to Lucius why he killed one of the more reliable independent traders in Arizona. Although Aileron wouldn't be punished too severely for such a thing, the idea of being lectured by the head Praetorian and the possible movement to an even lower station prevented the realization of that idea. Instead, Aileron swallowed his rage, patted the man roughly on the shoulder, and said in a murderously calm way, "See that you do, Dale Barton." Dale was still stunned for a moment as Aileron's head turned back to the artillery piece. Aileron heard the traitor finally collect himself enough to say, "Sorry about the mix-up, Centurion Aileron. I know I should have done a bit more searching while I was down there. Must have slipped my mind." Aileron barely heard the traitor's apology, for he was still an expert at hearing only words that were actually important. This is why he heard it when Dale said, "Just heard about Caesar's arrival at the fort and wanted to get him something that might help y'all win here at the dam." Still studying the howitzer, Aileron said to Dale, "This gift of yours is not something that will help us. If anything, you have given us a new burden. Not to mention that you still ask for compensation." Turning to meet the traitor's eyes, Aileron said, "Not only is the relic broken, but even if it were functional, we have no means of training any special contubernium on the operation, loading, or firing of this weapon. Actually, I did get this for you." Aileron was about to pummel Dale for interrupting him, but was more curious to see what Dale was fetching. Dale removed his hand from a leather bag on one of his Brahmin and placed a dirt-spattered manual for the howitzer in Aileron's hand. When Aileron read the cannon's model and the U.S. Army heading at the top of the pamphlet, Dale added, "The book should have everything you need to know about operating the thing. Perhaps even a picture of its parts, too. Haven't really had a chance to flip through it on the road." Aileron's eyes drifted to the nearby cart that had 2 crates marked 155 millimeters, and asked Dale, only slightly less infuriated, "How much ammunition have you brought for the relic?" "Should be about 10 or so. I think one of the crates only has 4 shells instead of 5, said the traitor as Aileron took this in. so there will be no ability to zero in the sights, assess trajectory, test fire, etc., stated Aileron, making Dale feel as though his gift to Caesar was even more of a burden than it already was. Dale finally offered, "Follow the manual right and you won't have to fire any test shells if I reckon correctly." Aileron let the trader's words hang and finally looked one more time at the howitzer, and all those slaves and soldiers idly waiting for the order to proceed. Just then, Aileron saw his staff senior enter his peripherals and heard Decanus Soranus say, "Centurion Aileron, Lucius has authorized the placement of the gun atop the interior section cliffs." He also agreed to authorize the requested payment for the gun. Aileron turned to his senior and replied, "Fine," as he motioned for Soranus to stand by for a moment. At last, Aileron met the eyes of Dale once more, still feeling as though the trader's gift was the most unworthy gift the Legion ever received. Not only this, the trader's request to be paid for the nearly useless gift almost made Aileron disembowel Dale right there when he heard the request for payment had been authorized. And so, Aileron looked straight into Dale's eyes and placed a small bag full of gold coins in his hands as he said, "Now, take your payment and get out of my sight before I stuff you in the barrel of this heavy piece of useless trash." Turning to Soranus, Aileron heard Dale pocket the sack of gold as he shouted, "Soranus, escort the slaves to the gun position and use those recruits if needed. Send someone to fetch me if you require more hands." Soranus was already seeing to the howitzer's movement up the hill when Aileron had departed at last. Dale had disappeared into the ether just as Aileron ordered, passing by the trader's caravan on his way to the gates back down the hill to the lakeside encampment. This was Aileron's life since Caesar's arrival. A whole lot of planning, a whole lot of new soldiers, and more than a few frustrations as Caesar's plans for the Mojave continued to expand in new and unexpected ways. Around 2 weeks later, late March 2281, Aileron's life went on in that idle and frustrating way for a short while longer before one particular day near the start of April 2281. As usual, it was the late morning on a cloudy day, and Aileron was making his rounds when his path around the lakeside encampment finally landed him at the shoreline once again. As Aileron heard the distant action of the sprawling camp behind him, he looked out over the lake as he'd done countless other days in the monotony. Aileron had his staff and contubernium officers running sparring and training exercises in the camp's designated training section, which he knew would keep them occupied for the better part of the day. Still, Aileron knew he was trained and able enough to avoid partaking in the training session, and decided to use this time for idle thinking as he looked out at the lake. It wasn't long after taking his place on the shore that his solitude was ended by a presence behind him that identified itself. "Ave, Centurion Aileron, true to Caesar." Aileron thought he recognized the voice and turned slightly around to verify. It was who he assumed, but the reason for the approach was unknown to him as the head of the Frumentarii stepped up. As Vulpes Inculta placed himself beside the centurion, the two shared the view of the lake as Aileron calmly greeted the man back, somewhat thankful for the unexpected approach. After greeting, the ensuing silence was only a brief one before Aileron asked, "What is your cause for approach, Frumentarius?" Aileron knew what the spy would say, and knowing that wasn't a true comfort. The spy merely said, "I just happened to be getting ready for departure again after a short time in New Vegas when I saw you here and thought I'd offer my presence." Aileron had the occasional run-in with the spies who used to report to him since Caesar's arrival, but each run-in, though cordial, left Aileron feeling slightly mocked. No longer was Aileron authorized to hear official intel on matters pertaining to the spies, but the spies regularly offered Aileron at least some lesser-known news whenever he happened across one of these Frumentarii agents in the Fortification Hill grounds. Aileron knew these instances of irrelevant disclosures were seen as a form of pity that the Frumentarii held for Aileron in his new menial role. As much as Aileron didn't care for the pitiful nature of his recent interactions with the Frumentarii, he still accepted it whenever it happened, even if it was only to combat the idleness. The centurion finally managed to offer the spy, "Your presence is tolerated for the moment, Frumentarius." The two narrowed their eyes as familiar grins passed on both of their faces in the following silence. Eventually, Aileron added, "Where you headed now? Back to Vegas or elsewhere? Provided I'm authorized to hear the vaguest nature of your current directives." The fox's grin went a bit wider before disappearing again. Just finished up the final details of a new alliance in the Vegas region. Now I'm headed south to look into a few matters pertaining to the terror forces. Still focused on the darkened lake beneath the overcast sky, Alaron asked plainly, are these new allies on the strip-free side or west side? Or perhaps final touches on the Khan's alliance? As you'll recall, I was more than informed about the Khan situation not long ago. The winds blew softly around them, the silence telling Alaron what he was expecting Vulpes to say. Apologies, Kinturian, and I'm afraid I cannot offer you anything pertaining to my completed directives in the Vegas regional limits or my coming tasks in the south. Alaron only let out a simple, before the frumentarius glanced at Alaron and added, the idleness of this waiting period is clearly getting the better of you. Might I suggest seeking permission to join the fight proper, by way of Nelson? Alaron had heard the news of a new outpost at Nelson a bit less than 2 months earlier. In fact, he personally approved the request to raise the commander in charge over there to veteran. Why a prime decanus named Dead Sea was put in charge of the fall of Nelson was unknown to Alaron. But the record of the incident spoke for itself, and Alaron no longer questioned the strange operating procedures of the terror forces down south. Either way, Alaron saw what the Southern Front was looking like since the fall of Nelson firsthand, and the idea had crossed his mind before. Ever since Nelson fell to the Legion, several of the sentries in reserve at Fortification Hill had been slowly moving south to pass through Nelson before storming the NCR's new front line at a place called Forlorn Hope. No, Alaron was still hoping the day would come that he'd be given a more important assignment here at the fort. Although the idea of moving south was looking better by the day, Alaron still felt he could put off a suicidal charge on NCR's new Forlorn Hope for a bit longer. Alaron finally answered the spy's suggestion. Perhaps later, my forces are currently busy helping to set up the new staging grounds when they aren't drilling. Vulpes nodded his head in remembrance. The new encampment and future position of our coming legate. I must tell you that the current layout and fortification is excellent, and I'm sure the butcher of the East will be very pleased when he finally arrives on the front. Alaron felt somewhat proud of being recognized for the new bastion below the fort's west end, having been one of the designers of its layout, although Alaron was also left wondering what Vulpes was going to add. The fox went on, I'd still consider seeking action in the south once the staging grounds are properly set up if I were you. Quinturian Montano has been excellently leading the pressure on Forlorn Hope since he took Nelson 2 months back. Alaron kept his composure, but the mention of Montano left him slightly frozen in contemplation as the spy concluded. The war in the south could present you with the perfect opportunity to show your old rival how to pull a victory from an unfavorable circumstance like you did at Bullhead City. The Centurion took all this in and didn't know what to make of what he was hearing from the spy. After a moment, Alaron only said, I thought that Decanus Dead Sea led the fall of Nelson. Vulpes replied, just as coolly, Dead Sea was only placed in charge of the fall. Montano is his Quinturian. And Montano has been leading the occupation of Nelson while launching raids through the new access the town now permits. Alaron thought how he now more than ever didn't want to go south if there was any chance he'd be under Montano's command. Even if Montano was only just Alaron's temporary or acting commander, as he and his force were waiting for the next assault on Forlorn Hope, the idea threw that notion out entirely. Vulpes picked up on this attitude of Alaron and knew the proposition was something that might have to wait before offering it again. So, Vulpes concluded. But alas, that is neither here nor there. All I understand is that my current directives in the south will put me in a more western area of operation, as I am currently ignorant about the particulars our forces on the southern front are enduring. When Vulpes was done, Alaron didn't have much more to say, and only replied, Go with Mars, Frumentarius. The spy rested a firm hand on Alaron's pauldron for a moment before it left, taking the Frumentarius with it as he departed the shoreline. Alaron was still deeply thinking about Montano and all he'd been up to in the south. He wondered if Montano had been on the south end of the front since the terror started, or if he was a new arrival that came at some unknown point. Had Montano really been on the same front as Alaron for so long, and he was just now hearing about it? All these thoughts continued to plague Alaron, and he found himself thinking more about the rival who bested him than he had his whole time on the Mojave front. That very same day, Alaron found himself in the audience of legionaries and officers surrounding the arena cage. The sun had set below the mountains, the sky was dark, and the light of torches illuminated the fortress overlooking the dam. War drum continued to beat, and Alaron saw the fire pit just above the arena giving off its faint glow to the soldiers on the little ridge above. Even the dogs of Antony, the master of hounds, were seemingly upset by the fight below, as the sound of training drums and officers' barking orders were buried by the anger around the arena. Between the death threats from the attending officers and the shouts from other rage-filled legionaries, the victor inside the arena cage appeared to have pissed himself as he stood with wobbling legs in the center of the ring. The victorious slave inside knew himself that he was only victorious because the 4 other skilled fighters managed to kill one another before they could turn to the cowering weakling. Still, the coward was the only one left standing in the arena after such a bloody fight, and the rules were the rules. Alaron turned to the arena master, a man called Otho, and asked him beneath the savage shouts around the cage. Should such a creature really be granted his freedom for a display of cowardice like that? Otho turned to Centurion Alaron and replied coolly, "Mars forbid, Centurion Alaron. But I believe I orchestrated this fight around a chance to serve rather than freedom." The response immediately made Alaron let out an amused scoff. That thing? Becoming a legionary. The man in the arena cowered even further into the wall until the shouts behind and the prick of a blade at his back made him jolt again towards the center. Otho replied to Alaron, "My Centurion forgets the abilities of our instructors in the camps." Alaron contemplated this begrudgingly until Otho added, "Care to take the lead on this coward's breaking?" Alaron nodded at the arena master and grinned. A moment later, the gates creaked open and Alaron whistled for his staff decani to remove the coward from the arena. Just as angry as the audience, Alaron's staff gave the victor no mercy apart from his survival as the man was pummeled and dragged out of the arena. Alaron ordered his staff where to have that future legionary sent, as Otho calmed the crowd by his announcement of victory. The crowd was calmed enough by learning what was in store for the coward when he reached the camps, and Otho announced the next fight. Alaron missed the opening to the next fight due to being occupied by matters of his staff, but he knew who was next as he returned to the arena cage and watched the ranger woman get thrown inside. Alaron had been excited to see this fight since he first shot her foot 2 weeks prior. Since recovering from her injury only a few days ago, Alaron watched her kill 2 other legionaries in a single arena fight. Although he personally considered challenging the ranger slave himself, Alaron ironically didn't deem one-on-one combat to be his style. At least one-on-one combat with a slave anyway. So, the ranger slave remained an object of odd fascination and bitter hatred to Alaron, as well as the other legionaries or officers occupying the fort. This night was only different in that Alaron had heard of who was challenging the ranger now, for it had been a long time since he heard the name coming to end the ranger. Otho the arena master shouted for the crowd as a plumed helmet and muscular beast entered the arena. Alaron couldn't see the centurion's face due to the mask he wore. However, the steel mask on the challenger's face was one that Alaron recognized. He thought he saw the steel mask of a centurion of the Flagstaff Palati in the torchlight. Centurion Alaron thought this was interesting, but the uniqueness of the challenger would soon be realized as the arena master began the introduction. Soldiers of Caesar. You may have seen this woman eliminate 2 legionary recruits, but be prepared to watch this profligate slave's destruction in the face of a true servant of Caesar. Alaron remained calm, watching the centurion challenger remove his long ornate blade, which served as another indication of this centurion's position in the Flagstaff Palace Guard. More of the attending legionaries and officers banged on the arena cage and shouted what they wanted to do to the ranger slave, as the slave herself did nothing other than toss her given blade onto the arena floor. The slave's gesture only created another uproar in shouts about the stupidity of profligate arrogance, while the continuation of the challenger's introduction was about to smack Alaron in the face with a blast from the past. This centurion of Caesar's elite guard, a commander of 10 other elite centurions of the first cohort, has fought for our emperor since the fall of Sedona to the destruction of the civilized valley. He led our forces in southern Arizona to end the Ajones, the Hydebarks, the Devil Dogs, and his victories painted the plains of New Mexico red with blood before he personally decorated the wilderness of Colorado with the severed heads of countless savages before rising to elite. Presently in charge of a detachment of the Palladi Guard, this esteemed commander chose to use his respite, giving you soldiers on the Mojave front yet another example of Legion victory. Soldiers of Caesar, I give you, elite Centurion Praefectus Praetori Gula. Alaron could scarcely believe it. He hadn't seen or heard about his old senior of Centurion their staff since a passing report he read back in 2271 while he was with the Interfector in Circle Junction. It appeared that Gula had finally departed his inherited role as commander of the 6th century sometime in the Meat Grinder campaign and finally went to the place that all centurions who served so long went. Alaron felt proud that Gula finally became a proud member of the elite first cohort and was in charge of a contingent of other elite centurions in the palace guard. Alaron began wondering when he himself was going to be granted an elite title. But the thought made him think about how lacking his battlefield record had been since becoming a centurion under the Interfector's tutelage. Sure, his record as a centurion saw to the end of the Twin Mothers, the fall of Denver, then the victory at Arizona Spillway, and then that incredible triumph at Bullhead City. But Alaron knew his record was still essentially nothing compared to the one held by that guy, Centurion Montano. Alaron was momentarily upset by the idea of his rival becoming an elite first, despite Alaron being a centurion for longer. Alaron really wished that Volps hadn't brought up Montano's name in the first place, and tried very hard not to think about all the battles his rival had been in, as of late since apparently taking Nelson. Centurion Alaron then shook the thought away and focused on the duelists in the arena. This seemed to work for him as he thought back to that one fight all those years ago between the then Decanus Gula and the warrior slave in the pen. Alaron grinned at the memory of how quickly Gula ended that giant Ajon warrior, and more importantly, what he did to the corpse. Just as Otho shouted, "Begin!" Alaron was thinking about how much of a morale boost it would be to witness Gula slaughter and consume the defiant ranger slave. Most of the legionaries and officers in the attending audience had not been around for the earlier days of the Legion. Most of these soldiers at the fort and those attending this fight may have seen the latter days of the New Mexico campaign at most, with some perhaps surviving the Meat Grinder, while the rest were likely soldiers fresh from the Auxilia campaigns or recent township assimilations. It was then that Alaron realized that he, Gula, and even Montano were some of the last surviving servants of Caesar who got to watch the Legion's rise. And the thought made Alaron experience a somewhat tragic feeling as he considered himself to be one of the last of a dying breed. As sad as this idea was to Alaron, he saw the masked faces and dangerous eyes of all the legionaries around him in the firelight, and saw their inherited viciousness, as old as centurions like Alaron were. The system that Lord Caesar created and fine-tuned over the years pumped out the same kinds of savagely loyal and barbaric soldiers of ruthless civilization that Alaron had seen come and go over so many years. With the start of the arena combat and feeling the familiar atmosphere of a Legion mob ready for battle, Alaron was left only with one thought. If only we could show this fight to the profligate soldiers atop the dam, this evening would have been perfect. Alaron continued to think about this as Gula let loose the first flurry of savage swings. The fight between Gula and the slave certainly wasn't as rapid as that notable one Alaron remembered so well. Not only did Gula not plant the blade in this slave's skull within the first 6 seconds, but Alaron briefly noticed that elite Centurion Gula wasn't quite as spry as he was 2 decades prior. Just as Alaron thought this, he saw the ranger slave duck under another swing before Alaron's attention was turned to the voice behind him. Like a reflex, Alaron turned instantly from the fight to the sight of his staff senior standing behind him. Veteran Decanus Soranus said to his commander beneath the shouts of the crowd, "Centurion Alaron, your presence is required at your command domicile immediately." Alaron was about to tell the man just to take acting command or whatever the situation was, but the eyes of Decanus Soranus said something else, something important that not even Soranus really knew the significance of. Alaron saw this and felt an unusual sensation wash over himself before he left it at that. Centurion Alaron didn't even need to inquire about the situation further after receiving that feeling, so he just wordlessly nodded at his staff senior, and the two departed. Leaving the shouts of the arena attendees in the distance, Alaron and Decanus Soranus headed through the gates of the interior fortress, down the hill, and down even further to the bustling lakeside encampment as they approached his command domicile. A few minutes later, Alaron opened the flap to his tent and found a man in horrendously bloody rags and a completely broken state kneeling in chains between two veterans in the center of the tent. Alaron approached the chained man slightly confused before noticing Gabriella in the corner, darting her gaze in equal confusion between the prisoner and her master. Before Decanus Soranus could offer the introduction, and before any of the veterans gave their salutes or hails, one of the veterans showed that this meeting was of the utmost importance when he spoke straight to the point. Centurion Alaron, by order of Centurion Roboro, we're here to leave the fate of this recovered deserter, veteran Decanus Falco, to your charge. Alaron was left completely speechless, and the prisoner raised his head at the commander he was kneeling before. At the same time, the ranger slave had brought elite Centurion Gula to the ground and twisted his neck in one swift motion, ending the fight.